Greetings. Shabbat Shalom. You know, back in 1903, the Wright brothers flew for 59 minutes. 59 seconds. And this was the acknowledged, most people would acknowledge this was the beginning of modern aviation. And then in that relatively short period of time, we come to July 20th of 1969, and three Americans, Wright brothers were Americans, of course, three Americans landed on the moon 50 years ago today as I'm speaking. And I'm speaking not far from the Kennedy Space Center, the area that we in Central Florida call the Space Coast. And of course, the moon is very important. There was a child that was speaking about astronomy, and this child said, "At night, when I look up at the sky, I see the light of the moon. The sun, I look up and see the sun in the sky in the daytime, when it's light anyway." Well, he didn't quite understand. But obviously the moon is important, and it's our companion in the celestial sense, and it is just an exciting time, as we commemorate that special time. And it's a special time in our family too. We're on the move, changing residences. Back in the spring of 1995, a group of commandment-keeping Christian ministers gathered together and formed an organization which they called the United Church of God and International Association. And as they were gathering together, one of them, who was a journalist, started up a newspaper which he called In Transition. And around that time, I was preaching on Pentecost in San Antonio, Texas, and I was promoting that publication, In Transition. And I told the brethren there, you might as well quit if you haven't got it. IT, in transition. Well, right now our family is in transition, and we're settling into a new residence, and it's a very interesting time. And of course, for many people, this season of the year is a time when they're on the move, maybe taking a break from the normal routine, or getting outdoors more as well, because the weather in most places is more conducive to that. It's interesting that on the sacred calendar today is the 17th day of the fourth month, and that's the beginning of a sober period, a 3-week sober period when Jews think about a lot of disasters that occurred in their history, and particularly surrounding the destruction of the first temple and the second temple. So Orthodox Jews normally fast on the 17th day of the fourth month, and this year they'll be fasting tomorrow on Sunday, the 18th. But it's interesting about the 17th day of the fourth month, which I pointed out in the talk I gave this morning, that was the 17th day of the fourth month, interestingly, is on the sacred calendar the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, of its adoption on July 4th, 1776. That happened to be on the 17th day of the fourth month. Just kind of an interesting coincidence. So on this day on the Roman calendar, when the world is commemorating the lunar landing, and the Jews of the world are thinking about the sober period that this day ushers in, it's also on the sacred calendar the anniversary of what Americans think of as the 4th of July. So just a lot of food for thought there. As we look up at the heavens, we think about the creator of the heavens, and the astronauts did too on that day that they landed on the moon. They acknowledged the creator, and our creator, among many things that our creator is, he is perfectly wise. And if we want to be wise, we want to go to our God for wisdom. He has said that he'll help us in that regard. He's perfectly wise. He's omniscient. He's, of course, omnipotent, omnipresent. He's perfect love. He's eternal. And he will help us to have wisdom, as he helped the ancient King Solomon. Solomon, in fact, utilized his wisdom and put some of his proverbs to parchment so that we could have them today. And some of his proverbs were actually recorded in later years, during the period of King Hezekiah, who ruled around 700 BC. So today I want to ask us all to hear the men of Hezekiah. I want us to hear the men of Hezekiah, because those men recorded words for us that ought to be, among other words, helping us to live an appropriate way of life. They impart wisdom to us. Now, I learned when I was very young that there's knowledge, which is the mastery of facts, and there's understanding, where we understand rather the relationship of one fact to another. And then there's application of the facts, and that's wisdom, to know what to say and what to do, because we have the facts, we've interrelated the facts, now we apply that understanding. We have knowledge, we have understanding, and now we have wisdom. And we all could use more wisdom. And in James 1 and verse 5, we're told, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. So today, as I said, if my device will cooperate, I want to go to Proverbs, the 25th chapter. And in Proverbs 25, we have Proverbs from Solomon that were recorded, put into the biblical canon by the men of Hezekiah. And so I ask us, all of us, hear the men of Hezekiah. These also are Proverbs. This is Proverbs 25 and verse 1. These also are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied. So let's hear some of these points that we see in these verses. And I'd recommend you read the entire section, of course. I'm going to cover some highlights from my perspective. I'd like to go to Proverbs 25 and verse 11. One of the things we learn from Proverbs, and also from the general epistle, the book of James, which is a New Testament book of wisdom, one thing we learn is the importance of words. If you really think about it, so much of our life is either enhanced or hurt by words. What we write and what we say, they have such a tremendous impact. And what people write to us and say to us have such a tremendous impact. And there's just so much power in communication. And in Proverbs 25 and verse 11, it says, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. You know, if you communicate the right thing at the right time, and we certainly want to be encouraging other people in what we have to say and what we have to do. But I mean, what particularly what we say is what the focus is here, because what we say impacts what we do, impacts what others do. Later on, we find an interesting verse here. Have you found honey? Eat only as much as you need, lest you be filled with it and vomit. So sometimes you find you're involved in something really good, really sweet, but you can overdo those kinds of things. And if you overindulge, if your lifestyle, if your way of life is overly indulgent, ultimately it backfires. And so we have to, in effect, be balanced in what we do. Even in what we enjoy, we need to be balanced. Later on in this chapter, if we go further, I want to go to verse 25. And again, the importance of words and how they can encourage. As cold water to a weary soul, so is good news from a far country. And I apply this verse to the preaching of the gospel. Let's call the far country, in this case, heaven. Today we're talking about the moon, landing on the moon. We have three heavens in the Bible. We have the sky above, we have outer space, and then we have the third heaven, the spirit realm, where we have God, where there's God's throne and the angelic realm. And you could say that the gospel is good news from that angelic realm, that heavenly realm, from God's heaven to our earth, from the celestial to the terrestrial. And it is good news, and it is encouraging news. And among other good things we can hear, the gospel is the best that we can hear. But even in any case, it is on this earth, as we live this life on this earth, good news can really be helpful. As cold water to a weary soul, so is good news from a far country. Let's go now to the end of that chapter. I was talking about honey before. It is not good to eat much honey. He warns us again. Too much sweet. We know from a physical point of view, too much sweet is not healthy. A little bit, yes. The saying from Mary Poppins, a little bit of sugar helps the medicine go down in a most delightful way. On the other hand, you don't overdo it. And that's true about other things that we enjoy, that we have to be balanced in how we live. So he says it is not good, they say it is not good to eat much honey. So to seek your own glory is not glory. So, in other words, if we're trying to always promote ourselves, it's not going to work. If we're just out there trying to boast about how good we are and how wonderful we are, that's off-putting, and ultimately it's self-destructive behavior. So let's go to the conclusion of this chapter, which relates to that. Whoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a city broken down without walls. You can't, undefended, vulnerable, not in the best repair. We have to have control over ourselves, self-control. That's part of this concept of not having too much honey. Enjoy honey, but don't have too much. That's a matter of self-control. And using the right words is a matter of self-control. The first thing we have to do in this life is have control over ourselves. That is really the great battle that we have to fight. And if we don't have control over ourselves, as it says here, we're quite vulnerable. And we can really be very badly hurt if we don't have self-control. So those are some highlights from Proverbs 25. I want to go now to Proverbs 26, and I want to begin around the 11th verse. And some of these Proverbs are quite graphic, and they're intended to, rattle us a bit, shake us up, get us to thinking. So here's Proverbs 26 and verse 11, which, as you know, the Apostle Peter quotes, and maybe most of you are familiar with it more from the New Testament. When I was in Orthodox Judaism, one of my professors who was modern Orthodox and who tended to be a critic from the inside, excuse me, and by the way, Jesus Christ played a role of that sort in the first century. He came to his own, He came to the scribes and Pharisees, and from within that heritage, he criticized it. And anyway, we had a fairly liberal, Orthodox, but liberal within Orthodoxy professor who's quite famous now. And I had him as a professor many years ago. But he used to say, it's interesting that in the yeshiva world, if you quote a scripture, they'll often tell you where it is in the Talmud, rather than where it is in the Bible itself, because the focus was so much on Talmud study. Well, it's true also in among Christians. Many verses that you're familiar with that are Old Testament verses, but you're familiar with them from the New Testament. That's not necessarily a problem. It's just interesting. But here we have in Proverbs 26 and verse 11, as a dog returns to his own vomit, so a fool repeats his folly. If we are foolish, we're going to keep making the same mistake. And I know a lot of us have this problem. Now, don't despair. If you have God's Spirit, you have the capacity to grow and to develop, and to do better. But I know that often, we could kick ourselves because we keep making the same mistake over and over again. But we're only human. But we can grow and we can develop and we can overcome. And we certainly don't want to be foolish, as this proverb says, and just continuing to do foolish things we've done before, to make the same mistake. You understand the principle. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, Shame on me. Now, the Proverbs often talk about being foolish, different ways of being foolish, different kinds of fools. There's different Hebrew words in the Proverbs for fools. It often warns us about not being a fool. And then after all these warnings, then you see this. Proverbs 26, verse 12. Do you see a man wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for him. So after the Proverbs is warning us about not being foolish, then it says, you think you're so wise? You think you're always right? Well, there's more hope for a fool than for you. You have to be willing to understand that you're like everybody else, and you need to continue to grow and make adjustments, make corrections. It's like this fellow that says, I never make mistakes. Well, one time I made a mistake. That's when I thought I was wrong, but I was really right about it. No, we all need to grow and to develop and to make adjustments and corrections. Let's continue on. One way people can be foolish is if they don't have enough desire to just get out and work. Without effort, nothing gets done. And the Bible encourages us to work, and to work hard, and to work diligently. On the other hand, it also encourages us not to be workaholics, to have a balance. In fact, one day a week, we don't work. We don't go to our regular jobs. We rest. I'm speaking on the Sabbath. I'm so grateful for the Sabbath. I know you are. But laziness is a problem in this world, and a problem that all of us at times have to deal with, virtually all of us. I know some of us are also workaholics and have to be careful and be balanced. But in verse 13, it says, the lazy man says, there's a lion in the road. A fierce lion is in the streets. You find excuses for not doing what you should do. It's kind of like this old story that I heard when I was a boy, about people up in the hill country, hillbillies, and many of them have beards, in these stories that you hear. Hey, Pa, your beard's on fire. Well, don't you see me praying for rain, Ma? Well, that's what I'm saying. Some people have all kinds of excuses for not doing what they need to do. So a lazy man says, there's a lion in the road. A fierce lion is in the streets. As a door turns on its hinges, so does a lazy man on his bed. You have to get up and get going. The lazy man buries his hand in the bowl. It wearies him to bring it back to his mouth. Very graphic language here. The lazy man is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly. So some people, you just can't talk to them, and we don't want to be that way. We don't want to be the kind of person who can't be spoken to. If I'm speaking to you week after week, hopefully, words are penetrating. And in verse 17, he who passes by, and this is now coming into another subject, but it's also talking about foolish behavior. And this became famous back in 1964 politically, so you can look that up sometime. I won't go into it. But let's take a look at the proverb. He who passes by and meddles in a quarrel not his own is like one who takes a dog by the ears. If you pick up a dog by the ears, it's likely to deal with you, to be upset and to bite, bark at you and bite at you. So sometimes, if people are having an argument, it's none of our business, so let's keep it that way. It kind of reminds me of when I was living for a while in Quebec. And I noticed there was a tense environment there between the francophones and the anglophones, and there were people who were really patriotic for Canada. Quebec is part of Canada. Then there were those who were, patriotic for Quebec. Quebec ought to be a separate, independent country. And I said to myself, I've got enough problems in my own life. I don't want to get involved in this problem. So Quebec is a very pleasant place. I don't want to talk it down, but there is that trouble there that I hope over time is settling down. I haven't been there in a while. I hope by now things are settling down, and perhaps those days are behind, and Quebec can just move forward. I hope so. But But in any case, we don't want to be getting involved in disputes that are not any of our concern. We now go to Proverbs 27, and I do want to go to the 8th verse. I believe is what I want here. Like a bird that wanders from its nest is a man who wanders from his place. I wanted to take a little bit of time with that. I gave a talk some time ago, and it's probably available still on YouTube. And my son Daniel did some graphics, so I thought the talk was effective with the graphics. And I talked about the fact that back in the book of Revelation, messages were given to 7 churches because each congregation had a certain corporate personality. And so that there were strengths and weaknesses there that could be discussed. And I said that you can apply that to the North American continent, and I'm sure that other areas could talk similarly, but I was particularly familiar with the North American continent, and there are cultural zones within the North American continent, and each one has its own strengths and weaknesses, and so I addressed, in effect, letters to the 9 churches of North America, in a sense. Now, there are some unique areas, because there are like major cities that are conglomerates, but there's also regional characteristics. And in the United States, for example, in North America, for example, we have New England, the extreme northeast, and it has a certain character. We have then up in Canada, we have what used to be called New France. You have Quebec, and again, as I said earlier, Quebec is a unique kind of a region, and that spills over into the northern part of New Brunswick. Then you have the industrial heartland of the United States, and some people would feel that perhaps the area around New York and New Jersey and so on is distinct, but in a way there's a general industrial heartland that goes through the middle Atlantic states, and the culture there is different from New England further to the north and to the east. Then as you go south, you have an area which at one time was a separate country. Much of those people are culturally distinct in a way. The area has the nickname Dixie, and that's a different sort of area. If you go further south, you come to South Florida, which is really culturally connected to the Caribbean, and it has a distinct flavor. When you get south of, I'm trying to think of the area, more or less Lake Okeechobee, so on. When you get south of there, and you have a different culture. As I said, the southern part of Florida is in effect a center of a culture that is based in the Caribbean and in the northern part of South America. Then as you go further west in the United States, well, by the way, this area of the industrial heartland expands into Canada, into Ontario. The culture of Ontario is very similar to the American Atlantic states, and actually Windsor, Ontario is south of Detroit. Then when you go further west, you come to the middle of America, and that's the breadbasket region, and the Midwest of America, that region, a great agricultural zone, is again culturally distinct in many ways. Then when you go further west, you come to the Rocky Mountain area. And by the way, that zone of mid-America extends up into Manitoba, into Canada as well, and Saskatchewan. Then as you go further west, you come to Alberta, and then you go south, you come to the Rocky Mountain area. That's again distinct. Then you come to the Pacific Northwest, which up in Canada you have Vancouver and that area, British Columbia, and then you have Juneau, Alaska, and you have that region and the northwest coast of the United States, and that's again another different distinct area. Then you go to the southwest, and you have Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California, which again is culturally distinct. And what's interesting is you find that those areas are large enough that there's variety within those areas, but there does tend to be a certain distinct cultural flavor. And I think you'll find Americans do a lot of moving, but when they want to finally settle down in an area, they tend to settle down in an area that is generally where they grew up, culturally where they grew up. And so when you find yourself completely removed from the cultural zone where you grew up, I want to go back to that verse, Proverbs 27 and verse 8. Like a bird that wanders from his nest is a man who wanders from his place. If you feel a little bit awkward right now, perhaps where you're living, it may be that you spent your first 18 years till you got out of high school in a very different cultural region. And maybe now you're in a region which is culturally distinct. And maybe you never just thought about it. And I'm not saying you need to leave, but you might be aware that there are these differences, and they tend to be subtle, where you don't notice them until you think about them. But in any case, it's just interesting, the wisdom in the Proverbs to know about such things as that. And I want to go now to Proverbs 27 and verse 17. Proverbs 27 and verse 17. As iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. Having a good friend is really precious, and you can really help each other and edify each other and build up each other. And of course, on the other hand, as the Proverbs also say, negative companions will pull you down. But certainly appreciate positive friends that lift you up, and that you can lift them up. It's a beautiful way it's put here. As iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friends. I want to go to Proverbs 28 and verse 14, I believe is what I wanted here. Happy is the man, this is Proverbs 28, verse 14. Happy is the man who is always reverent, but he who hardens his heart will fall into calamity. We need to be aware of the spiritual realities. Sometimes when we're dealing with day-to-day pressures, we forget the bigger picture. And it's so important to have that awareness of God and his plan and the value of your life and the lives of others around you. And to keep that big picture, to keep that spiritual vision of God's kingdom, and to, as it says here, to be constantly reverent, and not to get so bogged down in the physical that we become overly carnal. So it's just a beautiful warning here. Happy is the man who is always reverent, but he who hardens his heart will fall into calamity. And to conclude, I want to go to Proverbs 29 and verse 18. But I have time to cover the 17th verse as well. And it talks about rearing children here. And there was a family who had very nice, obedient children, and they came to services on the Sabbath, and there was a minister who was very impressed with how their children behaved. I'm not sure that he was a minister then, but he became a very prominent minister later. But he noticed how well these children behaved, and he commented to the parents. He said, I noticed when you come to church on the Sabbath, your children are very well behaved. And so the parents said, well, we work with the children 6 days a week, and they give us rest on the Sabbath. So we have to take the time to be parents. And as it says in verse 17, correct your son and he will give you rest. Yes, he will give delight to your soul. So we don't want to be absentee parents and neglect our children. We have to be very much involved in the lives of our children. And of course, we're not overbearing, as we know in other verses in the Bible. We let them develop and become more and more mature and ultimately be adults on their own. But even when they're adults on their own, we can be helpful, and we can be there when they need us, hopefully their entire lives. This was the way certainly my mother was, who recently died. She was always very, very helpful to me as her son, my entire life, her entire life. And as I said at her funeral in Connecticut, this was an example for Linda and me with our children and grandchildren, to always be there for them, God willing. I want to go to verse 18 now in Proverbs 29. Where there is no revelation, the people cast off restraint. So if we don't have, as I said before, that spiritual vision, if we don't have that concept that there's more to life than just, the here and the now, then we don't have proper discipline, and we live in a self-destructive way. So we need to have that vision. We need to have, in our case, we understand, we need to have the Word of God to guide and direct us. Where there is no revelation, the people cast off restraint. But happy is he who keeps the law. Happy is he who keeps the law. It is for our own good that we are obedient to God. It's for our own good that we are Christian commandment keepers. So these are some of the Proverbs of Solomon that the men of Hezekiah, as God directed them, placed into the canon of the Bible. I've read some of them today. Hopefully you'll read all of them. I want to go now back into the New Testament using modern technology to do so. And I want to go to the book of Jude as it concludes. And I want to go to a more literal translation. The Old King James is a more literal translation. So I want to read this verse because I'm emphasizing in this talk wisdom and going to God for divine wisdom. We of course learn by experience, by having to make decisions, by having to live, and we should be growing in wisdom. And as we get older, we should be increasing in wisdom, and therefore we should be a resource for younger people. And hopefully that's what we are. Those of us who are older, hopefully we are a resource for younger people. And all of us can go to the ultimate resource, the ultimate source of wisdom, and that is to God. As Jude 1:25 says, to the only wise God, our Savior, who alone, I want to go back to the Old King James, to the only wise God, our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power, both now and forever. Amen. All the best to you and yours.